menit yang lalu, Pak Craig Kinner. Beliau akan menyampaikan presentasi dengan judul yang sudah tertera di tembok sana, The Historical Jesus of the Cosmos. What can be known about Jesus using basic historical methods? Jadi tentang Yesus sejarah. Nama saya Agustinus Jawiri, saya pembantu Ketua 1 untuk bidang akademik. Nah, kami sedang rapat tim pemimpin. Jadi begitulah ya, rapat di sana, di sini. Yang satu tugas ke sana, ke sini. Saya diminta untuk membuka acara kuliah umum ini. Sekali lagi, selamat datang di STFT Jakarta dan terima kasih untuk panitia yang telah mempersiapkan kuliah umum ini. Kami berharap kuliah ini dapat bermanfaat untuk tentu saja dunia teologi, tetapi juga bermanfaat untuk hal-hal yang praktis bagi kita semua yang aktif di gereja, siapapun yang ingin terus menggali ilmu teologi. Saya lihat ada Pak Anwar Chen dari LAI di sini, dan saya kenal juga beberapa teman dari sebagian besar dari Perkantas ya. Ya. Jadi selamat, betul ya. Saya lihat beberapa ya. Jadi selamat datang, selamat menikmati kuliah umum ini. Terima kasih.
Selamat siang kembali Bapak yang terkasih. Terima kasih untuk kehadirannya yang mendaftar 105 orang di luar mahasiswa STFT Jakarta, dan nampaknya sebagian besar sudah hadir. Kita akan segera memulai seminar ini, dan seminar ini tadi sudah dijelaskan tentang sejarah Yesus, sejarah historical Jesus. Dan sebelum kita memulai di mana beliau berpresentasi, kita akan bagi termin dulu, mengingat kita akan mengadakan seminar dari jam 2 sampai jam 5 selama 3 jam. Maka kita akan bagi ke dalam 2 sesi. Sesi yang pertama adalah pemaparan makalah dari beliau. Nanti akan ditayangkan PowerPoint projection-nya. Dan sesi beliau akan dibagi 2. Berarti dari jam 2 sampai jam 4. 1 jam pertama makalah yang pertama, 1 jam kedua makalah yang kedua. Pada saat jam 4 tiba, maka presentasi diasumsikan sudah selesai. Kita akan break 5 sampai 10 menit, ada disediakan kopi dan teh di sana, beserta nanti nampaknya ada snack juga. Dan sekitar 4:05 sampai 4:10 kita kembali untuk sesi kedua berupa questions and answers, pertanyaan, diskusi, dan lain-lain. Selama sesi berlangsung, saya berharap tidak ada pertanyaan dulu untuk menghindari molor waktu. Kalau ada pertanyaan, tolong langsung dicatat dan diajukan pada saat sesi kedua setelah break. Kira-kira bisa kita sepakati demikian ya, Bapak sekalian ya. Oke, untuk tidak membuang waktu, kita akan segera mulai. Profesor kita, we would like to invite you to present your papers. So you will have 2 sessions. The first one is for your first presentation on historical Jesus, and the second one, I cannot recall your second one, but it will be at
they'll both be on that. Sorry, yeah, they'll both be on that subject. It's just that the second one I'll deal with the material I couldn't get to in the first one. But is it okay to open in prayer?
You want to open a prayer?
Is it all right?
Professor Kuliah wants to open this session with prayer, but is it okay if I ask the audience to pray? One of the audience.
Sure.
Okay, I would like one of the audience here to say a prayer for us. Maybe from the women here.
Yes.
One of the women here
Good.
wants to say a prayer for us. To start off. That's the blessing of sitting in the front.
Yeah.
sorga, Bapa yang kami sembah dalam Yesus Kristus, dan Roh Kudus, kami datang di siang dan indah ini Tuhan, berkumpul bersama Tuhan untuk dapat mendengarkan kesaksian yang akan kami dengarkan Tuhan, seminar ini Tuhan yang disampaikan oleh hamba. Tuhan, tolong kami pimpin dalam seminar ini Tuhan, dari awal hingga akhir dengan Roh Kudus. Biar dalam kuasa kasih-Mu senantiasa yang memberkati kami. Jamaah kami Tuhan, setiap kami Tuhan yang hadir di tempat ini, biar kehadiran Tuhan yang ada di tempat ini. Terima kasih Bapak, serta Tuhan, serta yang belum hadir di tempat ini, sehingga mereka dapat tiba di tempat ini dengan penuh sukacita yang sama dengan kami Tuhan, untuk mendengarkan pemaparan dari Profesor yang akan berkata kepada kami Tuhan pemaparan Yesus Kristus. Terima kasih Bapak, terpujilah Engkau Bapa yang selalu kami, supaya kami berkenan di hari ini dalam Kristus Yesus dan selamat seminar kami ini, rangkaian acara demi acara yang selalu kami lakukan. Terima kasih Bapak, haleluya, amin.
Amen. All right. When we talk about the historical Jesus of the Gospels, I'm doing it from down here so I can see the PowerPoint too. When we talk about the historical Jesus of the Gospels, there are some limitations in terms of what we can know from basic historical methods. Most events that happen are not recorded in history. How many of you have had any conversations in your life? Have you ever talked with anyone? How many of you remember all those conversations? How many of you have recorded all those conversations? So most things that happen are never recorded. And of what's recorded, even less can be verified by other sources. So when we talk about historical Jesus research, it's not saying that this is all that Jesus did. It's just saying this is what we can say based on historical methods. But generally, we trust reliable sources. If my wife tells me that she had a conversation, of course, I'll believe her when she says that. So it raises the question about how reliable are our sources. There are some different sources that are sometimes used for studying the gospel, for studying Jesus, but the strongest sources are the Gospels. If we look at other historical evidence for Jesus, we know there are a lot of different opinions. In the US, there's something called the Jesus Seminar that actually accepts a fairly small percentage of Jesus' teachings as reliable. And there's some others who are more skeptical than that. And then there's some others who, on the other side, are so sure that we have Jesus' exact wording, which makes it difficult when you compare the Gospels and find out that the wording differs from one Gospel to another. But some scholars are skeptics, not just on the popular level, but some scholars are skeptics. And sometimes this influences even Christian scholarship. Why don't we have more non-Christian evidence about Jesus from the ancient world? Well, often only movements that were interested enough to preserve early information about their teachers wrote things down about their teachers. Have you heard of, how many of you have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Yeah, most of you have, I think, heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls. Well, they revered their founder, whom they called the teacher of righteousness. But nobody else in the ancient world reported anything about him. Only the Dead Sea Scrolls talk about him because they were the only people who cared about the teacher of righteousness. The founder of the Pharisees, the founder of one of the schools of the Pharisees was Hillel. And yet Josephus, who claims to be a Pharisee, who writes about the Pharisees, never mentions Hillel, important as he was, and doesn't mention much about the other founder either. When a Roman historian talks about the Judean revolt that led to Jerusalem being destroyed again, he never mentions the leader of that revolt. We know about that leader especially from coins and from the later traditions of rabbis. We actually don't have anything in this Roman historian that names the leader of the revolt. In history generally, as one Israeli scholar points out, we can hardly expect to find information about Jesus in non-Christian documents. It's the same with Moses, Buddha, and Muhammad. The non-believers from their own time didn't really mention them because they weren't considered significant to the interests of those who were not believers. Even in the case of the philosopher Socrates, there are only a few works that talk about Socrates from his own generation, and the ones, or from the generation immediately following him. And the only ones that give us anything significant about Socrates are written by his followers. Now you do have another allusion. Aristophanes was a comic playwright, and he talks about Socrates walking around looking up at the sky and a bird plopped in his head. You know, but that's about all you have from people who were not followers of Socrates. There are some brief non-Christian sources about Jesus, but they're very brief. They don't tell us a lot about Jesus. We have Thales, somewhere in the mid-1st century. We also have a Syrian by the name of Mara bar Serapion who says that Jesus was a wise king of the Jews. But again, they don't tell us much about Jesus. And I think I need to stand closer so this works. Okay. Leading historians of the Roman Empire. I hope you won't feel badly on this side if I move towards this side, but it's just I'm trying to make my slides work. Tacitus was a leading Roman historian from the early 2nd century. And Tacitus does mention Jesus in Annals 1544, but he mentions him only because Jesus became an issue in Rome. Jesus' followers in Rome, the Christians, were falsely accused by Nero of starting a fire. So he began burning them alive to light his imperial gardens at night. He reports that around the year 60, concerning the year 64. So concerning a year about 3.5 decades after Jesus' crucifixion. Suetonius, in the early 2nd century, seems to talk about some followers of Jesus even earlier than this, in the 40s of the 1st century in Rome. But notice that they only pay attention when Jesus' followers are in Rome. They didn't care about him otherwise. The focus of these Roman historians was Rome. They were interested in the provinces only insofar as the provinces related to Rome. So they were more interested in Jesus' movement than they were in Jesus himself. But if we compare other historical figures from the same period, we have the same kind of evidence. Actually, we usually have less evidence. Herod Agrippa I was king of Judea from the years 40 to 44. Josephus talks about him extensively. Josephus was a 1st century Jewish historian. The Roman historians, however, don't seem that interested in him. Tacitus mentions him only once, and just in passing, because he wasn't of interest so much in Rome, even though he spent time in Rome. Pilate. Jewish sources talk about Pilate. We have an inscription from Pilate, but he appears in Roman sources only one time. And that's, again, in Tacitus's Annals 1544, where Tacitus says, when Jesus was executed, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate. So non-Christian sources actually mention Jesus more than any other messianic or prophetic leader in 1st century Syria or Judea. If you look at what later rabbis say, and they were generally not positive towards Jesus for whatever reasons, but they had traditions that Jesus was a miracle worker. And not only did they speak of him as a miracle worker, but they treated him as his followers often as miracle workers too. Is the sound still all right? Okay, it's just easier for me to. Josephus, who was a 1st century Jewish historian, writes about John the Baptist and baptizing people, writes about James, the brother of Jesus, and the majority of scholars think it's also authentic where he writes about Jesus. And it's confirmed by an ancient Arabic inscription without the insertions that were added by later scribes, that Jesus was a wise sage. That is, Jesus was a teacher, so presumably if he was a teacher, he had some teachings. And also that Jesus was a worker of wonders. And also that Jesus was viewed as a threat to the political establishment, and he was executed. But the Gospels give us much more information about Jesus. They're our largest source about Jesus, which is what we would expect, because followers of a teacher are normally the ones who report and record the teacher's teachings. Well, how would people approach the Gospels? How would the Gospels have been viewed by a first century audience? Say if you were coming to a library in Alexandria, or in the 2nd century, the Library of Celsus in Ephesus, you find the Gospel of Mark, a single volume work about a single historical person. And if you look at overlap among other works, you find out that this work is using sources. What would an ancient reader call this? The majority of scholars today, especially since Richard Burridge's work in the 1990s, early 1990s with Cambridge, the majority of scholars today recognize the Gospels as ancient biographies. Now, and we just published something on this just a few months ago, some more information about ancient biographies and the Gospels. Now, some scholars in the 20th century said that the Gospels are not biographies, and they were pretty much correct in what they meant. The Gospels are not modern biographies, but they are ancient biographies. And this can have some implications for us. It doesn't mean that they were verbatim. There was no way people could record words verbatim back then, especially if it was a teacher just teaching orally. Sometimes things could be verbatim if they were written down, but not normally if it was just oral tradition. But it also suggests to us that if they're biographies, they're meant to communicate the substance of Jesus' ministry and teachings. So, did Jesus teach love your neighbor? Did Jesus teach forgiveness and so on? The message of the kingdom. I mean, all these themes that we have in his teachings, yes, we have extremely good reason to believe Jesus did teach these things. And we actually know a lot about Jesus historically. By the standards of ancient biography, the Gospels are early and good records. Now, of course, as Christians, we approach the Gospels with faith. But here, just talking from a purely historical perspective, we also recognize that, yes, there's a lot that we can say about Jesus historically. But the Gospels are ancient biographies, not modern biographies. Modern biographies are usually in chronological sequence. Ancient biographies were usually arranged topically, according to theme. Usually modern biographies start early in life. Sometimes ancient biographies did that. Matthew and Luke do that, for example. But often ancient biographies start with the person's public career. So, for example, in the Gospel of Mark, it pretty much opens with Jesus' public career after being introduced by John the Baptist. A biography was almost the only kind of work in antiquity that was focused on a single character, other than a play, which would be in poetry, or other than a novel, which usually was not about a character who lived in history. It was usually about somebody made up, and usually about people a long time earlier. And if it ever was about a historical character, it was about a historical character who lived centuries earlier. So the only thing that actually fits in terms of ancient genres is the genre of biography. Biographies were mainly a sort of historical writing. One of my professors, when I first began my PhD, said that ancient biography was fictitious. The Gospels were ancient biography, and therefore the Gospels were fictitious. There was a problem with his argument, though, because as I tried to show him, ancient biographies actually were not meant to be fictitious, especially if they were writing about a recent character. And he admitted afterwards that he really didn't know anything about ancient biography. He hadn't read the ancient biographies. He read it in a book, but anyway, many of us who've done the research since then have gone through the gamut of ancient biographies. Biographies were very different from novels. Novels lacked clear sources. They didn't have a historical preface like Luke has. And usually they were romance stories. The Gospels don't really fit the genre of romance, right? I mean, who's Jesus' wife or girlfriend? If he had one, she's not mentioned in the Gospels. Biographies were historical in character, but like historians, they worked from pre-existing information. Oh, now it's going too fast. Okay. Historians and biographers sought to teach moral lessons. That is, they wrote from certain perspectives, they tried to communicate certain ideas. But they did that based on information. It wasn't just like getting up and giving a speech, this is what I think you should do. Rather, you would find somebody in history who did that and say, this is a good example. And so that fits the Gospels. Actually, it doesn't fit ancient novels, because ancient novels did not try to teach morals, usually. There are a few exceptions. And history, biography, and novels all tried to be entertaining. So if it's fun to read, that doesn't mean it's a novel. It just means it was well written. But granted that biographers were substantially accurate, how accurate were they in their details? Well, that depends on the biography. Some used a good bit of flexibility on details. They had to get the basic story right. They had to get the event right, but they had flexibility on details. But they weren't allowed to invent events. The way that we can evaluate particular biographies, particularly, is this. Were they writing about the recent or the distant past? That makes a difference. And how closely did they stick to their sources? Am I blocking your view of the screen here? Okay, is the sound all right if I stand here? Can you hear me in the back there? Okay, good. Oops, now I can't see the screen. All right. What kinds of sources did biographers often use? I've actually worked through some ancient biographies, and some of my doctoral students have worked through ancient biographies, and some other scholars have done this too, and looked at the range of different kinds of sources that they used. And often they were oral sources from eyewitnesses. They would consult eyewitnesses, or they would consult earlier written records where those existed, and so forth. Well, what kinds of sources did they often use? When they were writing about the distant past, they sometimes said, all we have are legends. We don't know. This happened centuries ago. We don't know. But when they're writing about somebody within the past generation or two, they normally would say, okay, we consulted eyewitnesses, or we consulted people who knew the eyewitnesses. So it's within living memory. Now, sometimes, even when you're talking about centuries earlier, the biography could be substantially accurate. For example, our best information about Alexander the Great, our best biography of Alexander the Great, comes from 400 years after Alexander the Great died. He died in 323 BC. So Arian is writing this over 400 years later. Now, the Gospel of Mark, how much later is the Gospel of Mark than the conclusion of Jesus' ministry? About 40 years. Some say a little bit less, some say a little bit more, but usually they say about 40 years. That's only 1/10 the length of the time with Arian. But Arian depends on earlier biographies that are now lost. So, Luke says that there were many sources in his day, and we can assume that there were a lot of people who wrote about these things. We don't have all of them left, but we can make use of them. When writing about the recent past, for example, the Gospel of Mark, they often were or depended on eyewitnesses, or depended on those who had interviewed eyewitnesses. And again, this is based on looking at a bunch of different ancient biographies. There was a range of historical reliability. Plutarch and Livy were a bit more flexible with their information, but they were writing about figures who lived many centuries when they were writing about figures who lived many centuries before them. And they often would admit that. They would say, some of this is shrouded in legend. It's from many centuries ago. But Tacitus and Suetonius, who were writing about figures of the previous 100 to 150 years, they stuck very closely to their facts and are often used by historians today with great confidence. Josephus, first century Jewish historian, was somewhere in between. He makes himself look really good in his autobiography. Archaeology, though, confirms him very often. including in the architecture of the harbor that Herod the Great built in Caesarea, and even down to the color of paint on Herod's bedroom wall. I have no idea how Josephus knew anything about Herod's bedroom, but anyway. Historical standards. If you look at what ancient writers said about history and biography, they were very clear that it needed to deal in facts. It could teach moral lessons, it could be put in an eloquent way, but it had to be based on facts. If you weren't going to base it on facts, there were other genres, other literary types in which you could write. And these are just some quotations from some of the different writers, not only historians, but people who weren't historians commenting about historians. Just some examples. If you look at biographies of recent characters, they stayed close to their sources. Their objective was not to invent things. It was quite different from novels. So I want to take one concrete example, but I'm just going to do it very briefly because you probably are not extremely interested in Otho. How many of you have heard of the Roman historian Otho? How many of you, not Roman historian, Roman Emperor Otho? How many of you have heard of the Roman Emperor Augustus? Augustus lived a lot longer than Otho, and Augustus also had better propaganda than Otho did. But the biographies of Otho, I'm going to look at two biographies of Otho that were written about 50 years after Otho. So about the range that the Gospels are written after Jesus' public ministry. And also, besides those two biographies, a work of history written about 50 years later. And I want to compare them in the same way that we compare the Synoptic Gospels and see if there's any kind of overlap. Well, I'm just showing you some of the overlap I found when I made the comparison. As you can see, there's a lot of overlap among these sources. And this can be done not just with Otho. Some of my doctoral students are doing their dissertations on this, and they're examining other ancient biographies. But as you can see, they weren't just freely making things up. They were dependent on sources that were available to them. In Suetonius' brief biography, I found about 50 points of correspondence with each of the other sources. Now keep in mind that Suetonius' biography is less than 2,000 words long. It's only 28 paragraphs. It's less than 1/5 the length of Mark's Gospel. So if Mark was following the same biographic method as Suetonius was, when Mark writes about Jesus and Suetonius wrote about Otho, you know, we could expect maybe 5 times as much information in Mark. And keep in mind, this is not simply where Suetonius had information. This is simply where Suetonius had information, and we can confirm it from other sources. How closely did the Gospels use their sources? Well, in what I'm telling you now, this is what you already would have heard. This has been known for a long time. But the Gospels didn't copy things the way we did today. I think there's an article that is going to be sent to you by email because it's much cheaper to copy it by email. Well, back then, they had to copy it by hand. So you wouldn't all get a copy of the article if we did it that way. But almost everyone acknowledges that Matthew, Mark, and Luke are closely related. That's why we call them synoptic gospels. John says that there was so much else that could have been reported about Jesus, the world couldn't contain it all. That's hyperbole, common hyperbole used in the ancient world. But what he's saying is there are a lot of other things that could be said. But the synoptic gospels cover a lot of the same material because they're using the same kind of sources. Not everybody agrees on exactly the structure of this, but most scholars, and if we're wrong on a detail, it won't really change the function of this, but most scholars think there's oral tradition, possibly notes. Well, at some stage there were notes, maybe not right away. And Mark and what we call Q, or at least many of us call Q, that is a common source for Matthew and Luke. Oh, do I need to move? Okay, sorry. Sorry. It's so exciting that even the sound system is getting excited. Okay, thanks. So I'm back on your side now. I hope I'm not blocking your view over here. Matthew and Luke probably draw on the second and third levels below. And some scholars say that Matthew and or John were eyewitnesses. If that's true, they also draw directly on the first level. The problem is I can't get this to work from that far away. Let's see. That's very good. He has a PhD from Germany. He's very smart. Okay. But people sometimes get a little too speculative with sources, you know, and so there's some things we don't know for sure. But the Gospels clearly and undeniably have differences. Nobody can really deny that. I mean, in Mark, Jesus cursed a fig tree, cleansed the temple, then the disciples find the fig tree withered, he gives a lesson on faith. In Matthew, Jesus cursed a fig tree, the fig tree withered at once. Jesus gives a lesson on faith, and then he cleanses the temple. The sequence is different. But remember, ancient biography did not have to be in chronological order. So it's not a problem. These kinds of differences that we find in the Gospels, especially the Synoptic Gospels, were well within what we find in ancient biography. In fact, when Josephus writes about his own life and covers the same events that he covers in his history of the period, he contradicts himself far more than the Gospels differ from one another. Biographers used some of the same techniques that we find in the Gospels. So they could omit some characters or combine some actions to keep the focus on the main story. So for example, in Matthew, the centurion pleads directly with Jesus in Matthew chapter 8. In Luke chapter 7, the centurion sends intermediaries. Well, Matthew can leave out the intermediaries. It's not a problem. He does that with the intermediaries from Jairus about his daughter. So it was a common biographic technique. It's not something that would have bothered ancient readers. It's not something that would have bothered the writers of the Gospels. Sometimes there's adaptation to make the language more precise. Luke cleans up Mark's grammar. Matthew changes Antipas from king, as he is in Mark, to the more precise way of calling him a tetrarch. And in Mark, you know, the paralytic is let down through the roof. Matthew leaves out the roof. Why does Matthew leave out the roof? Matthew, maybe he's against tearing up people's roofs. But probably it's just, you know, he abbreviates them for space reasons. Luke 1:1-4 tells us a lot about the sources that were available at the time that Luke was writing. There were written sources, there were oral sources, ultimately going back to eyewitnesses. Luke confirmed this, and in verse 4, Luke couldn't make things up because he says, I'm just confirming what you already know, Theophilus. So at least the basic elements of the story were things that were already widely circulated in his day. Luke probably wrote somewhere between 60 and 90. The majority of scholars date Luke Acts between 70 and 90, second largest group in the 60s, and third largest group is after 90. I tend to date Luke somewhere in the mid-70s, but whenever you date Luke, somewhere in that time range. Luke says that at the time he writes, many have already written about these things. Most scholars date Mark and Q within 4 decades of the events. So these could be among his sources. There could be other sources he has as well, because he says many sources. Let's see, what would be 4 or 5 decades ago for us? Did anything significant happen in Indonesia in the 1960s? How many of you know about things that happened in Indonesia in the 1960s? What if somebody said, no, those things didn't happen? Because you can't depend on people's memories that long. Everybody would have forgotten. Would you believe them? Is everybody understanding what I'm saying? Okay, all right, yeah, okay. They laughed. They are understanding. All right. So, I mean, 4 decades, 5 decades is not that long. There are still people alive who were alive in the 1960s. Actually, I was alive in the 1960s. I was just a little kid, but I was alive. So I know people who lived in the 1960s and were grown-ups in the 1960s. The nature of human memory, we forget more than we remember. That's true. Again, I asked you about how many conversations you've had in your life. Undoubtedly, you've forgotten most of them. But we remember key events that are significant to us. And in those key events, we don't remember all the details. We'll remember some details here and there. And we'll remember the basic gist of those details. This is the results of psychological memory research. And if we recount an episode regularly, we're going to tend to remember it in that form and tend to remember it. Of events that are significant to us, memory research suggests that after 5 years, we still remember 50% of what we considered significant. And whatever we remember after 5 years, we're still going to remember for the next 50 years unless, you know, sometimes with older age things start happening with forgetfulness. But obviously Peter, John, and others would remember many episodes from the life of Jesus, from the ministry of Jesus when they were with him. Now, there are different forms of memory. Psychological research shows that there's verbal memory, there's sensory memory, like, you know, it gets imprinted through the sense of smell, through hearing, and so on. There's manual memory, like how you should hold a microphone so you can still hear from it. There's also verbatim memory, for remembering something word for word. Verbatim memory is usually short. We usually don't remember things word for word very long. But in ancient education, they would memorize certain short sayings. So we can expect certain short sayings of teachers to be memorized. That was the fundamental feature of ancient education. So some of Jesus' aphorisms, his witty sayings, we can expect some of those may have been preserved very, very carefully. And from one gospel to the next, the gospel writers seem to treat them in the same way. Episodic memory, that's remembering a scene from our life, something that happened in our life. And they're succinct narratives with a few details, and basically we don't remember it verbatim, but we get the basic gist. Well, that's what most of the stories in the Gospels are like. They're episodes. They're actually preserved in the Gospels in the same form in which memory normally preserves that kind of information, episodes. So this was argued in something published by SPL in 2011. Somebody was doing psychological memory research in the Gospels. That, and also in antiquity, they called these the same thing. They called them crai. Papias, who writes in the early 2nd century, speaks of these gospel narratives as crai, which was a rhetorical form that's basically an episode. Parables are distinctive for Jesus. They're episodes, but episodes that Jesus told, and they're usually preserved the same way with the gist. We have a lot of parables from antiquity, from Jewish teachers. The early church didn't carry on this activity of telling parables, at least in our other sources. They gave illustrations, but story parables seem to be unique to Jesus. Now, how accurately can oral sources be transmitted? Luke says in Luke chapter 1 and verse 2, just as these stories were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. The word handed down here is paradidomi. Say that with me, paradidomi. Good, you know Greek. Paradidomi can mean a bunch of different things. It actually can mean betray or hand over, but it also can mean to hand on oral tradition. It's often used in ancient writings for teachers passing on tradition to their students. Well, how accurate could this be? that depends somewhat on the culture. But, you know, in the US, we usually have short memories, because in the US, people spend a lot of time on the internet. If they forget something, they just look it up on Google. You know, they don't bother to remember things unless they have a test. That's why we give people tests, so they'll have to remember. But it wasn't always this way in the US. One of my neighbors who passed away last year, I believe, she was 96 years old, and she says that before television and even before radio, she and her family, just like other families, they would sit on the front porch and they would just tell stories in the evening. And they would pass on stories from their ancestors. And she could tell me stories that went back to the 1700s that had been passed on in her family. Now, how accurate was it? Well, I was able to go back and check. I wrote down what she said. I went and checked it with historical records. And she got a few things not quite right, but for the most part, what she remembered that had been told her that was remembered by her parents and grandparents, the majority of it was right after a few hundred years. That's in the US. We couldn't do that today, most of us in the US, but it used to be that way. How accurate was it in the first century? Well, to look at that, we need to consider the question of memorization in antiquity, notes and sayings collections, some evidence for Aramaic rhythm. For some of these, I'm just going to cover them really quickly, but especially the evidence for memorization I'll cover in detail, and the prominence of eyewitnesses in the church. The exclusively oral period before things were put into writing, obviously once Mark is put into writing, it's no longer exclusively oral. We have something written. The exclusively oral period can't be more than a generation. Even though oral material could be added after that, but we know that things were being written down within a generation at the latest. In terms of how well people could remember things, the Mediterranean culture very much emphasized memory. It doesn't mean everybody always remembered everything, but they emphasized memory. There were storytellers who could repeat back stories that lasted hours in length. You had orators, public speakers. You know, they wouldn't be like me, cheating and looking at my PowerPoint. They just memorized what they were going to say that would be hours in length and just spoke. Disciples of teachers. This is the most relevant, because what were Jesus' disciples? They were disciples. Disciples of teachers, their primary responsibility in the ancient world was to be able to repeat back what their teacher taught them. Now, we know from the Gospel of Mark that Jesus' disciples didn't always do what they were supposed to, but at least what they were supposed to do was be able to recount his teachings. And they would learn the deeds as well. And often, disciples would publish the teacher's teachings afterwards, or they would commit them to somebody who was able to do that. Now, looking back at some of these in more detail, you had bards who could recount all of the Iliad and all of the Odyssey, all of Homer's poems, from heart, from memory. Some people say, well, only educated people could have such memories. It's not true. Most of these bards were illiterate. They couldn't read, but they knew it from memory, and they could recite it from memory. Just like today, there are people who can recite the Quran from memory who may not even understand Arabic, but they've memorized it. So here are some other examples. These are educated people. Seneca the Elder says, oh, my memory is bad now that I'm old. But when I was young, I could meet 2,000 people, get their names, and then repeat back their names in exactly the right order. That's a good memory. He was exceptional. But he says, now that I'm old, I can't remember so much. But hey, you know, the people I went to school with are famous orators. You know, someday those of you who are studying for ministry, you know, a lot of your friends here will also be ministers, and maybe you'll be able to tell stories from your preaching class about how they preached. You know, oh, I remember they preached this sermon, and this is what they said. I can't even remember what I preached in my preaching class. But Seneca could remember from back when he was in oratory school, he could remember about 100 of his fellow students' practice speeches, because it was really emphasized in that culture. There's one person who went to an auction, and at the end of the day, he could repeat back every item that was sold, the price for which it was sold, and the person to whom it was sold from memory with no notes. There was another person who went to a poetry recitation, and the guy up front was reading a poem that he'd written. And so the guy in the back, he said, "Wait! You stole that poem. I wrote that poem. I can prove it. I can repeat it from memory." And then he proceeded to repeat the poem from memory. He said, "It's my poem." And the guy up front was panicking because he really had written the poem, but he didn't know how to prove it now. And the guy in the back said, "No, I was just joking. I just wanted to show you I could memorize the poem while you were reading it." So, I mean, next time you have a midterm or a final, where you have an exam, remember this. See, you grade them hard, right? No, don't. No. Again, with speeches, they would often memorize speeches that were hours in length. And in terms of disciples, for the first generation or two, within living memory, normally they could be very accurate. And discipleship was a pedagogic setting. It was a setting where students would rehearse and pass on their teachers' teachings. And I have a bunch of, all through ancient literature, I have references for this. Both factors are relevant to the Gospels, because if you look at Paul's undisputed letters, we see that the leaders in the church in Jerusalem were, especially the eyewitnesses, who were not just eyewitnesses, but disciples of Jesus, who would have learned from Jesus as disciples in a pedagogic setting. It was the most widespread feature of ancient education. At the basic level, elementary education, you'd memorize the sayings of famous teachers. Then at higher level of education, you actually could memorize entire speeches and passages from ancient literature. It was true in the philosophic schools, where the members of a philosophic school would pass on the teachings of their teacher from one generation to the next. And the teachers often would say, "Okay, well, it's not my place to have to write all this down." They would leave it to their disciples, and sometimes the disciples would publish their teachings. And in ancient literature, we sometimes find that a disciple, the way they would practice, they would repeat back everything their teacher taught them, and they would keep repeating it until they could remember it. The Pythagoreans were especially known for this. It's said that they were not allowed to get out of bed in the morning until they could repeat back everything their teacher taught. So when tomorrow morning, please give them a test on all this. They would learn the teacher's deeds, the teacher's behavior, as well as the teacher's teachings. So, for example, rabbis, Jewish teachers, they would say, "Well, this can't be against the Torah because Rabbi so-and-so did it. So we know it must be all right." So they would sometimes use the examples of their teacher's teachings actually in their teaching. But also, there's a story of this one rabbi who was getting ready to make love to his wife, and he found a disciple under his bed. And he said, "What are you doing under my bed?" To which the disciple replied, "It is said that we must learn everything from the example of our teachers." If I find any of you under my bed, I'm going to call the hotel security. Also, we have the case of communal memory. It's not just one person remembering. It's like if I said something to you, sir, and you passed it on to the next person, we passed it all around, one person at a time, chances are somebody would get it wrong, and then it would, but we're not doing it that way. It's all of you hearing me at once. And so if somebody says, "I don't quite remember, what was that?" somebody else can always tell them if they need to know. And we have examples from the ancient world where teachers' former disciples would collaborate and put together the teacher's teachings. Now, Greek disciples especially often took notes. Did Jesus' disciples take notes? Well, they may not have all been able to read and write, but at least the tax collector probably could write some things down. So it's very possible that he could have taken some notes. Disciples typically published their teacher's teachings. Now, if the disciples were illiterate, they couldn't do that, but they could commission others to do that. Student note takers sometimes published them. This goes back for disciples as early as 5 centuries before the time of Jesus. So this was a common practice. And this was true in both major areas of education. Of course, for Jewish people, they were educated in Torah, in the law. But for Gentiles, the 2 major areas of education also involved taking notes. One was philosophy, the other was rhetoric or oratory. And I'll focus on the second example. Quintilian was a professor of rhetoric, of oratory. And you know, in a seminary context, we'd say a professor of homiletics. And his students were boys. They weren't, you know, grown-ups like we are. I think we're all grown-ups here. Anyway, they weren't grown-ups. So, we do have some, maybe some children, but he had students who were boys. They took careful notes in his lectures, and then they published the lecture notes in his name. And Quintilian said, I wish they would have consulted me first so I could have corrected certain errors of grammar and so on. But yes, the notes they took are what I said in my class. And rabbis especially emphasized oral education. Now, what we have from the rabbis is from a later period because we don't have any early writings from the rabbis. But it's consistent with everything else we find in ancient sources. So what should we expect of Jesus' disciples? Why would we expect Jesus' disciples to be less reliable than those of other ancient teachers? Presumably, if ancient disciples remembered their teachers' teachings, again, not always verbatim, but they remembered the basic substance of their teachers' teachings and passed them on, that's what we should expect, presumably, for Jesus' disciples as well. In fact, Q was probably already circulating while some of those in leadership in the Jerusalem church were still alive, like Peter and John. So W.D. Davies, who was a well-known professor earlier in the 20th century, points out that probably only a single lifespan separates the last New Testament document from the time of Jesus, like 65 years. That's a long lifespan in antiquity, but you do have some people who live that long. Looking at some relatively earlier traits in the Gospels. Now, I don't know if my hour stops from when we were supposed to start or from when we actually started. Should I keep going or should keep going for now? Okay. Is everybody still awake? Because in the ancient world, when students fell asleep, sometimes the professor would take something and throw it at them. It's true. I read it in the ancient sources. But anyway, some distinctively early traits remain in the Gospels. You know, the Gospels that we have are written down in Greek. And biography was a Greek form. Now, Jews who lived outside of the Holy Land, they often spoke Greek. In fact, that was what they usually spoke. Maybe some of them in Syria didn't, but, in further east they didn't. But in the rest of the Mediterranean world, Greek was their dominant language. So it's not surprising if these are written outside the Holy Land that they would be written in Greek, and they would use this Greek biographic form. And yet, there are sayings of Jesus in the Gospels that preserve elements that nobody would think of in Greek, that seem to go back much earlier. Now, I think all of you are bilingual, at least. You know at least 2 languages. If you don't, you probably don't understand what I'm saying. But my wife, she's from Africa. She speaks 5 languages. It really is embarrassing to me as an American because we're not so good in that. But anyway, most of us. But you know that when you go from one language to another, there are figures of speech that don't make sense in the other language. And so you can translate them literally, or you can translate them idiomatically in a comparable figure of speech. Well, in the case of the Gospels, sometimes they translated them idiomatically, but sometimes we actually have figures of speech that sound like Aramaic or Hebrew rather than Greek, and that point us back to some of the early sources. I'll go up and push the button if I need to. Sometimes we have a discernible Aramaic rhythm when it's translated back into Aramaic. The problem is there's more than one way to translate it back into Aramaic, so we're not always sure about this. But we do have that. We have examples of specifically Jewish figures of speech. For example, when Jesus says, "You have heard it said," that was a common Jewish expression. Or lust hyperbolically constituting adultery. Actually, that was an exclusively Jewish expression. Nobody else thought that. It would be measured to someone as they measured it to somebody else. Take the beam out of your own eye before you take the splinter out of somebody else's. These were standard figures of speech or expressions or teachings. The phrase, "To what shall I compare?" used for introducing parables. Jesus uses that. It was also used by other Jewish teachers. Now, a generation or two ago, a lot of New Testament scholars, there's still some, but a lot of New Testament scholars said that the interpretations for Jesus' parables couldn't go back to Jesus because, you know, they would be something that would be made up later. Jesus did not give interpretations for his parables. But if you actually go back and look at ancient Jewish parables, usually they have interpretations. So it makes more sense that Jesus actually did give interpretations to his parables. The first half of the Lord's Prayer very closely resembles the Kaddish, which was a standard Jewish prayer. Well, Our Father in Heaven was another, that comes from some other Jewish prayers, but the Kaddish said, "Exalted and hallowed be your great and glorious name. May your kingdom come speedily and soon." That sounds a lot like the Lord's Prayer. So when he's teaching something like that to his disciples, he's teaching them something that was already familiar to them in their culture. Jesus' teaching on divorce addresses specifically what we know that the schools of Pharisees were debating in his generation. Son of man. You know, I don't know if son of man, the phrase means anything in Indonesian, but in Bahasa. Okay. In English, it doesn't make sense. It didn't make sense in Greek either. It's just taken over directly from Aramaic or Hebrew. Son of man, moving mountains was a Jewish figure of speech for something that was virtually impossible. A large animal going through the eye of a needle was a Jewish figure of speech for something that was virtually impossible. Debating about which commandment was the greatest. The debate about whether you clean the inside or the outside of the cup first. Pharisees were debating that in Jesus' generation. So we have a lot of traits like this that take us back to the earliest memories about Jesus. Also, the eyewitnesses remained prominent in the church. We know from Galatians 2 and 1 Corinthians 15 that many of the leaders of the earliest church were actually Jesus' disciples, the ones who would be most expected to remember what Jesus taught them. Now, this next part actually deals especially with the resurrection. But would an eyewitness die for something that was false? People die for things that are false all the time. But people don't usually die for something that they believe to be false. And the disciples weren't just saying, "We believe Jesus rose from the dead." They were saying, "We believe we saw him alive from the dead," which is a step further than that. Also, the Gospels cite women's testimony to the resurrection, despite the prejudice against women's testimony in antiquity. Now, don't look at me badly. I fully support women's testimony, and I support women in ministry. all of that. But in that culture, most people did not. That's not something the Gospels would have made up, that Jesus chose to reveal himself first to the women disciples. So we've looked at oral tradition, we've looked at written sources, and I'm about to go on to verse 3, if it's all right. Is it, or do you want me? Kind of signal me when it's time to break. Okay. Okay. So Luke, there's a couple ways to translate this. A lot of translations say in verse 3 that Luke carefully investigated these matters from the beginning. I have a friend, David Messner, who wrote a whole book based on research on this. He went back through ancient historians and checked this language, and it actually may mean something other than investigated, which at first I found disappointing, but then he explained to me what he meant by it. It may mean instead that the historian is claiming that they have full acquaintance with this because they actually were there for part of what happened. Now that would fit when you look later on in the book of Acts, where it says we. I'll have to talk about that in a few moments because that's a disputed issue. But when could Luke have checked out some of these events? Clearly Luke was not there, the author was not there for the empty tomb or the day of Pentecost. I mean, if he was there for those things, you'd expect him to say it. But in Acts chapter 16, verse 10, and then on and off through the end of the book, we find that Luke, whoever Luke was, I think it probably was Luke, but that the author claims to, or the narrator claims to have been there. He says, we. Now, this is disputed among scholars, what the we means. And, you know, that's part of our job as scholars to dig into everything. So if something looks simple, we make it complicated. And if something's complicated, we make it look simple. But anyway, so scholars debated what the we means. And the majority of scholars think that the we is the report of an eyewitness. But it's really disputed. So let me just say, I wrote a 4-volume commentary on Acts. It's about 4,500 pages. It cites 45,000 ancient references. So I really checked on this. I really worked through the ancient sources when I was working on Acts. And honestly, if you read through ancient historians, when they say I or we, they mean I or we. There are reasons why people say that Luke couldn't have been there. They say, well, nobody who had actually been with Paul would represent Paul's views the way Luke represents them, because one of the big things they say is that Paul was against the law. Feelhauer said that a generation or two ago, but most scholars today don't think that Paul was against the law, especially in the new perspective on Paul. So Paul actually was not against the law, he was against a certain use of the law. But in any case, nobody's claiming that Paul wrote the book of Acts. You know, obviously this is a writer who has his own perspective. He's not even saying he's a disciple of Paul. He was a traveling companion of Paul at certain times. He's interested in his life, probably more than giving you his exact wording or anything like that. But some claim that this is a fictitious literary device. We don't have fictitious literary devices in other ancient historical monographs, which most people think that Luke Acts is. Some people have argued it's a novel, but I deal with that again in the commentary just to be concise. But it's obviously, well, even the person who was most famous for arguing it's a novel kind of sort of says now that it was history. He just doesn't think it was very good history. But anyway, some think it's left over from a travel journal, the We. I think that's probably true, but if it's left over from a travel journal, I think it probably was Luke's own travel journal, because again, in Luke chapter 1, he mentions many sources, but he never keeps an I or a we from those. It's only here. So he seems to be like a, you know, he's not in the main action, but he seems to be present for some of it, especially Paul's time in custody in the last 2 years. But notice that when he's with Paul, that includes the time in Judea for up to 2 years. What does that mean? Would Luke have had any time to consult any eyewitnesses or any people from the earliest part of the church? Is 2 years enough time to write something the length of Luke's gospel? I'm not saying he wrote it then, but would he have had time to consult people? How long is seminary here? 4 years? Do students write papers? At the end of 4 years, have you written anything as long as Luke's gospel? Probably. Yeah, so, I mean, two years is really enough time to research, to hear testimonies from early disciples. And he actually names some of them in the latter part of Acts. Also, in verse 4, Luke appeals to what was common knowledge in the church. So he says, in Luke chapter 1 and verse 4, I've compiled this information so that you may know or have certainty about the things that you've been taught. So these are things Theophilus has already heard. Luke isn't free to make these things up. These are things already in circulation, but Luke has confirmed these things. Again, I'm not saying verbatim, but the basic substance, this is what Jesus was like. You don't normally make up things that contradict what your hearers know. How many of you remember when I was here last week and I gave a lecture on paleobotany? How many of you remember my lecture on paleobotany? You don't remember? In the same way, Luke is probably not going to write to Theophilus and say, hey, remember all these things I'm telling you about Jesus, actually, you already know them if Theophilus didn't already know them. So he's confirming information that was already widely circulated in the early church. And you have other people doing that, like Paul in 2 Corinthians 12:12 says to the Corinthians, who really were messing up sometimes. He says to the Corinthians, you saw the signs and wonders of an apostle when I ministered among you. He wouldn't say that if they could write back and say, Paul, we saw no such thing. You know, it was something that was part of their own experience to which he appealed. Later debates central to the Gospels, later debates central to the early church were missing in the Gospels. In the mid-first century, one of the big debates among Christians was whether Gentile men had to be circumcised. Are any of you here Gentile men? You can be glad which side won the debate, right? That you don't have to, anyway. But if the church were making up things about Jesus, wouldn't they have made Jesus give a verdict on this? You know, wouldn't they have made Jesus more relevant to their time by making up stories? But that's not what the church was doing. In fact, when Paul deals with the story of Jesus, you know, he reports some things that Jesus said. That's not his main interest in his writings. But when he gets to, for example, Jesus teaching on divorce, he has a perfect opportunity to make up something for Jesus. He says, this is what the Lord says. The Lord says you're not allowed to divorce. And then Paul says, but here's a situation that Jesus wasn't addressing. I mean, divorce may be permitted in some cases. And so he qualifies Jesus' teaching, but he specifically distinguishes his own teaching from what Jesus said. He doesn't make up a saying for Jesus. Let's see. Yeah, if writers were freely inventing stories, we wouldn't have so much overlap. But the kind of overlap we have is the kind of overlap we have in other ancient biographies about recent historical characters. And let's see. So the Gospels are thus a good source for reconstructing Jesus' public ministry. Like all biographies, they include the biographer's perspectives. But we can say at least as much about Jesus as we could say about Socrates or Seneca or other great teachers of antiquity. The first century Gospels are our only extensive source. The earliest surviving apocryphal and Gnostic Gospels are from the mid to late 2nd century, and the vast majority of Gnostic Gospels are much later. Now, when we talk about memory, how long memories survive before they start getting corrupted, I talked earlier about something that went on for a couple centuries, but the memories are most accurate normally within living memory of the person. What that means normally is within the period that the people who knew the person are still alive. So after the 1st century, when you don't have many, at least, probably given ancient lifespans, maybe you don't have any of the original eyewitnesses alive, the memories are going to be less accurate. But in the 1st century, while you still have some eyewitnesses alive, they're going to tend to be more accurate. So in the next session, we will talk about the lost gospel some, and then we'll talk about one of the traditional Western cultural problems, well, not traditional, past few hundred years traditional Western problems with the Gospels, which is they report miracles. How can that be accurate? Okay. Yes.
Just go directly.
What?
Just go directly to the second.
Oh, do it now? Thanks. So what about the lost Gospels? You see here, this Gospel is lost. He can't figure out his way. It's amazing. Anyway, other Gospels. The other things that we call Gospels, actually, we should have a different name for them in a way, because they're actually different literary types. They're not the same literary type as the synoptic, well, as any of the 4 Gospels that are in the canon. There were we know from Luke, there were many accounts of Jesus circulating. So it's not that nobody was talking about Gospels. There were no other stories about Jesus before the end of the 1st century. There probably were some. And I can't think of a scholar alive who wouldn't be very excited if we found some of these others. In fact, sometimes I pray that we'll find Hugh. But anyway, but we don't have those others. The other sources we have are all from after living memory of Jesus. And research shows that collective memory or social memory declines, and legends arise after living memory ends. I don't know if any of you heard about the Gospel of Judas. It was widely promoted in the U.S., but the scholars who worked on it, they themselves said this doesn't teach us anything about Jesus. It just teaches us about views among some people living in the late 2nd century. So, like maybe 150 years after Jesus' time. It just got widely promoted because the people who were promoting it knew they could sell a lot of stuff. So on the popular level, you have a lot of crazy stuff like Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. I don't know if that made its way to Indonesia. Yeah, it's just nonsense. That's I don't know a scholar who takes it seriously. But also, in English we have a phrase, comparing apples and oranges. Do you have that phrase here? No. Some things are really very different. So some of these other things that we call Gospels are not even they're not the same literary type as the canonical Gospels. You have the apocryphal Gospels. Most of these flourished in the late 2nd and early 3rd century, which was also the period in which novels flourished. We do have novels earlier and later, but this is the heyday for ancient novels. And nobody in antiquity ever thought any of these should be canonical or should be treated as God's message or should be treated as historically reliable. They were, well, I shouldn't say nobody thought they were historically reliable, but barely anybody did. And if you look at some of the apocryphal Gospels and Acts, there's nothing wrong with a novel. I've read novels. I don't usually have time now, but so I'm not saying it's bad that we have apocryphal Gospels, but normally people could tell the difference. You have talking dogs. You have my favorite one is in the Acts of John, where you have John checking into an inn kind of a hotel, and they had bed bugs. And so he said, in the name of the Lord, go out. And the bed bugs lined up single file and marched out. I was happy because, you know, in most of these stories, they're pronouncing judgment and people are getting, you know, fires devouring people. But with the bed bugs, he didn't even kill them. He just had them march out. Another example is the infancy gospel of Thomas. Jesus strikes dead a boy who bumped him, and when the deceased boy's parents complain, Jesus strikes them blind. Does that sound like the Jesus in the Gospels? It doesn't sound like the ones we have in the first century sources. And we have a number of accounts like that. But many of these other Gospels are very late, like the apocryphal Gospel of John, not to be confused with what we call the Gospel of John normally, maybe comes from the 11th century. So a lot of these are very late. I don't really need to go into detail on all of these, like Gospel of Peter. Well, let me just tell you a little bit about Gospel of Peter. There's a self-rolling stone. At the tomb, the stone rolls itself away, and the cross actually walks. But you have a lot of anti-Jewish prejudice in this, and whoever wrote it didn't know much about ancient Judaism. The high priests actually spend the night in the cemetery. I guess some of your students spend a night in the cemetery, but that was for different, different purposes. Anyway, the Gnostic Gospels, as opposed to the Apocryphal Gospels, most of these are just collections of sayings. Again, there's nothing wrong with the collection of sayings, but it's a different kind of writing than what we have in the canonical Gospels. And also, the Gospels we call Gnostic, we call them Gnostic because they have Gnostic elements in them. We have no sources that actually document Gnosticism before the 2nd century. You have things moving in that direction before that, but full-blown Gnosticism, you don't have it until the 2nd century. Again, that's something that scholars have come to more of a consensus on in recent decades. The Gnostic Gospel said we have these secret traditions. That's why nobody else knows about them. Only we know about them because they're secret. But in saying that, what they were basically admitting was nobody else knew them because there was no evidence for them. Anyway, they're all much later. Gospel of Thomas is the earliest of these and may actually include some accurate tradition. The problem is figuring out which parts of it would be. It's usually dated around somewhere around the year 140. So again, even the earliest of these other sources is after living memory. This is about 70 years after the Gospel of Mark is usually dated. Some people date it even later, some people date it earlier. The closing paragraph of the Gospel of Thomas. You know, I support women in ministry, but the Gospel of Thomas did not. The Gospel of Thomas, the closing paragraph, Peter says, well, what about Mary? Can she be saved even though she's a girl? And Jesus said, yes. If women continue in the faith, they too will become men. Yeah, see, that's bad. I'm against that. So anyway, and then there are later Gnostic Gospels still. When the churches rejected these, it was based on the fact that these were later. They don't go back to the earliest witnesses. And actually, you can check many of these sources in terms of their background. Do they fit a Jewish background in the 1st century? And so on. Yeah, and the secret Gospel of Mark is usually believed to be a forgery today. But that's one of the sources some scholars were using to try to reconstruct things. I think I probably have said enough on that, but you have traces of Judean and Galilean customs in the 4 Gospels that we have, the 1st century Gospels. You even have local topography of Jerusalem right in the Gospel of John, even though almost all of us believe that John was written at least 20 years after Jerusalem was destroyed. So you have some memories in the Gospel of John. It's not a concern of the Gnostic Gospels. They didn't do things like that. So with that, I'm going to move on to the second issue. And as I close this, you'll see briefly my beautiful wife. I sort of did that on purpose so I could look at her while I'm away. Okay. One objection to the gospel's reliability comes from modern Western academic culture. And it's been a very common objection. It was actually one of the original reasons for skepticism about the Gospels. Many in Western, and this is especially European, but it's also true in the US in academic culture, many doubt that miracle reports could actually go back to eyewitnesses. So they say, well, this material must not be accurate, and if it's not accurate, how do we know about anything else in the Gospels? But today, there are hundreds of millions of miracle reports in the world. And so you can't say that eyewitnesses can't claim these things. You can say, okay, I don't believe they were miracles, but you can't say that nobody claims them because we've got lots of people who claim them. Not all of them are equally verifiable. Some of them actually are undoubtedly false. But we do have eyewitnesses who claim these things, and so I'm going to give you some examples of that. Starting with Lisa Larios, who's, okay, my laser, I think part of the problem is I need to fix my battery in here, but I'll do that another day. But Lisa Larios had cancer of the hip, and as a result of cancer of the hip, they found it too late, and so it had already spread throughout the rest of her body. Her parents hadn't told her yet she was dying. All that she knew was that she was unable to walk. And so her mother took her to a healing meeting, but was kind of reluctant even to do that because they didn't want their daughter to know how sick she actually was. And when they took her there, whatever you think about healing meetings, it doesn't really make any difference in this case because nobody prayed for her. But while they were praying for other people, suddenly she jumped out of her wheelchair and began running around. Well, sometimes that's just adrenaline. But in this case, she was completely healed. And not only was her hip healed, and not only did she have no cancer, but testing, x-rays, showed that the bones, where they had been eaten away by the cancer, the bones had actually grown back instantly. That's not something that can just happen by coincidence or just, well, I don't think it happens just by the power of the mind. But in any case, so there's an eyewitness account that's not just an eyewitness account from the mother and the daughter. It's also something where we have the medical records to actually back up the account. So mostly I just write commentaries. And so, yeah, like I mentioned my Acts commentary earlier. But because I was working on the Acts commentary at that point, and because I've worked on the Gospels, people bring up the issue of, well, eyewitnesses would never claim miracles. And I'm like, that's not true. Whatever you think of miracles, I know people who claim that they've seen them. And actually, I've seen some things myself. So you can't just say eyewitnesses don't claim this. So I was going to make it into a footnote. The footnote got out of hand. It grew to 1,100 pages. But sometimes I write long. Miracle and exorcism accounts comprise over half of Mark's gospel before you get to the Passion narrative. So if Mark is our earliest biography of Jesus that we have today, and Mark is recounting healings and exorcisms, chances are people were remembering the people that experienced healing and deliverance through his ministry. Roughly 1/5 of the book of Acts also consists of these scenes. So they're a common reason for skeptics doubting the historicity of these works today. And it's not just in Mark, but it's in every layer of early Christian tradition. You have it in Q. Again, not everybody believes in Q, but what many of us call Q. In fact, Jesus is explaining his miracles in the language of the Old Testament in Matthew 11 and Luke 7, and also in Luke 11 and Matthew 12, he says, if I, by the Spirit of God in Matthew, or probably more original, by the finger of God in Luke, if I am casting out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. So in probably our earliest source, Jesus already depicts himself as a healer and an exorcist. You have it again in Mark, you have it in material that's unique to Matthew, unique to Luke, unique to John. Paul speaks of it in his own ministry. He doesn't talk about it often, but in talking about when he was planting churches, in Romans 15:19, he says, wherever I went, there were signs and wonders and miracles that followed. He also says it in 2 Corinthians 12:12, you saw the signs and wonders of an apostle when I was among you. He talks about it in his churches. In 1 Corinthians 12, he talks about it as one of the gifts. In Galatians 3, he talks about it, the miracles that happened among them. You have it in Acts. The rabbis talked about it. Celsus talked about it. He was a 2nd century critic of the Christians, but he didn't deny that Jesus did miracles. He said, yeah, Jesus did miracles, but that doesn't make him a good person. The book of Revelation talks about them. The church fathers talk about it still happening. Irenaeus in the 2nd century, actually, in the late 2nd century, talks about a church in France where the dead get raised. They pray for the dead and they get raised. He says that, see, you Gnostics, you talk about power, but look what happens in our churches. So it was still happening in some churches later on, or at least that was still their belief that it was happening, whatever you believe about miracles. The historical modern Western reason for denying miracles is they say, well, there's no credible eyewitnesses for miracles. And a couple examples of this were famous in New Testament studies. One of them, David Friedrich Strauss, who said that the miracle stories in the Gospels must be legends. And also Rudolf Bultmann, who's probably better known to us today, who had some other ideas that were very helpful, but this wasn't one of the ones I think was helpful. Strauss said that the gospel miracle stories must be legends. And he actually, to make room for the legends, he actually dated the Gospels later than pretty much almost anybody today would date them. But Strauss had a friend named Edward Morica. Morica was disabled. He could barely walk because of a diagnosed spinal problem. But after Edward Morica spent some time with the German Lutheran pastor Johann Christoph Blumhardt, Morica was not just walking, he was going hiking in the mountains. How did Strauss explain this? Strauss said the doctors must be wrong. He just must have been psychosomatically unable to walk. But notice what he does not say. He does not say that this was merely a legend that arose over a few generations, because he can't say that. Strauss should have known that eyewitnesses can claim the kinds of things we see in the Gospels. However, he wanted to explain them. Bultmann said that mature modern people do not believe in miracles. And actually, Bultmann dismissed the stories about Blumhardt, whom I just mentioned, the same way he dealt with the Gospels. He said, the stories about Blumhardt must be legends. But Karl Barth didn't agree with that. Karl Barth said, no, Blumhardt was one of my mentors, and part of the theology of hope in Barth and Moltmann actually refer back to Blumhardt. Today we have diaries and letters that confirm that these experiences from Blumhardt's time actually were real experiences, not simply legends. Well, Bultmann says mature modern people don't believe in miracles. It's impossible to use the wireless and to believe in the New Testament world of spirits and miracles. So it's just a presupposition. One of my professors, when I was doing my PhD, he's actually the one who talked about biographies being fictitious that I mentioned earlier. But he was a very strong Bultmannian. And I did the class presentation on Bultmann in that class. And I started with the things where I thought Bultmann was helpful. But then I said, Bultmann says that nobody in the modern world believes in miracles. But look, that dismisses from the modern world all traditional Jews, Christians, Muslims, traditional tribal religionists, spiritists. It dismisses 2/3 of the PhD students sitting around the table at that time. And it's just an assumption. You've just dismissed us from the modern world. But look, that's not an argument. A lot of people in the modern world do believe in miracles. Justo Gonzalez, a Methodist scholar, citing Latino churches, churches in Latin America, says that what Bultmann declares to be impossible is not just possible, but even frequent. Hua Yung, a recently retired Methodist bishop of Malaysia, says, Bultmann's problem, that's a Western problem. And I know some of those Western problems get exported to other parts of the world. But, who made up the rules to say you can't believe in miracles? Nobody in the modern world believes in miracles. Who made up that rule? John S. Mbiti, an African scholar, talks about the prejudices of people in the West who just dismiss actual experiences that happen in Africa, that everybody in Africa knows about, except the ones who just were trained in the West and can't believe the things. Most of the arguments against miracles go back to David Hume, who was actually rehashing the arguments of some radical deists. Even the early deists didn't go this far. But David Hume said, miracles, we know they don't happen because we have no credible eyewitnesses for miracles. Well, what happens if somebody claims to be an eyewitness? Well, they're not credible because they believe in miracles. It's a very circular argument. The first part of his argument might have worked a little bit better, but the first part of his argument is that miracles violate natural law. But his understanding of natural law didn't actually agree with the framers of natural law in his day. Isaac Newton believed in miracles. But Hume, the philosopher, wasn't depending on science here. He had his own view of natural law. He said, well, miracles don't happen. And also, his view of natural law doesn't fit the views of natural law in current science. His second argument is really the basis for his first argument. When he says that miracles violate nature, what he means is miracles violate uniform human experience. We know that miracles don't happen because, look, I've never seen any. My friends have never seen any. So we know they don't happen. Well, what happens if somebody else says they've seen one? Well, we know better than that because we've never seen it. So it's a circular argument based on his own experience. He even cites an example that was known in his day, and that was the example of Blaise Pascal's niece. Have any of you heard of Pascal? He's sort of like the forerunner of the modern computer. Have any of you heard of computers? Just joking, I'm joking. So anyway, Pascal's niece had a running eye sore, and it emitted a foul odor. It smelled very bad because it was always running. She was at a Jansenist monastery, and somebody touched her with a holy thorn from Jesus' crown. Now, do I believe it was really a holy thorn from Jesus' crown? No, I think Luther was probably right when he complained about all the relics that were circulating. He said that there were enough nails from the Holy Cross to put shoes on every horse in Saxony. But be that as it may, it was a contact point for her faith. She was instantly and publicly healed in the sight of many witnesses. The Queen Mother of France sent her own physician to check this out. And the physician reported back, yes, this is a real miracle. So what does Hume do with this? He cites this and he says, look, this is better documented than anything in the Bible. We have medical documentation for this. And we know this didn't happen, so why would we believe in any other miracle? That was his argument. And the modern dismissal of miracles is mostly based on Hume. People still say today often, well, how do we know miracles don't happen? Just read David Hume. Well, I read David Hume. I didn't find his argument convincing. Neither have a lot of modern philosophers. Major philosophic works have been written criticizing Hume's argument on miracles. published in recent decades by Oxford, Cambridge, and other major university presses because they find his argument unconvincing. One of them titled his book, Hume's Abject Failure. It's a criticism on Hume's argument about miracles. And the response to that, somebody responded to that, they said, "You just say that because you're a Christian and you believe in miracles." His response, "Actually, I'm not a Christian, but I just thought Hume had a bad argument." So, are there any credible eyewitnesses for miracles today? Well, if we start for the churches that are known for that emphasis, what churches are specially associated with miracles? All right, well, we'll just, anyway. I have to get closer. All right. There have been major academic studies on this. Oxford published a few years back a book called Global Pentecostal and Charismatic Healing. And there was a Pew survey that was done of Pentecostals and Charismatics in 10 countries. Pew is a very respected survey organization. And I'll just run through these. I'm not going to do all these in detail, but they didn't have Indonesia in the survey, but they had just Pentecostals and Charismatics in 10 countries. The number of those who claim to have witnessed divine healing comes out to about 200 million people in those 10 countries alone, and among Pentecostals and Charismatics alone. Well, what about those who aren't Pentecostal or Charismatic? The same survey also asked questions of those who said they were not Pentecostal or Charismatic, and somewhere around 39%, it was more in some countries, less in some other countries, but probably over 1/3 said that they had witnessed divine healing. Now, what did they mean by divine healing? Maybe a headache went away, but some cases were cases like the story I told at the beginning where, Lisa Larios was completely healed of cancer, and actually her bones were restored. Now, even in the US, a 2008 Pew Forum survey claimed that over 1/3 of people in the US claimed to have witnessed divine healing. And this is not just among Christians, this is also Hindus and others. So it depends on, some groups saw it more than others. Now, the point with this is not what proportion of these claims involve genuinely divine activity or miracles. Because there's nobody who would say all of these claims are miracles. And some people would say about some other people's claims, no, anything from that group I don't believe. But anyway, the point is whether you can legitimately start with the premise there are no good eyewitnesses for miracles. You've got hundreds of millions of people claiming to have seen these things. You can't just dismiss them and say, well, no, there are no credible eyewitnesses. Hume could do that when he was alive. But if Hume were alive today, I don't think Hume would make the same argument, because we know too much more. And it's not just people starting with Christian presuppositions. Millions of Christian backgrounds. And of course, other religions also have miracle reports. Well, some other religions also have miracle reports. But millions of non-Christians have been so convinced by what they have witnessed, or someone close to them witnessed or experienced, that they were willing to change centuries of tradition to become Christians. Some people have suggested that 70% of global Christian growth in the last few decades has been due to this. In China, there was a report from within the China Christian Council, affiliated with the Three Self Church, around the year 2000, that claimed that roughly half of all conversions in the previous 20 years were due to what they called faith-healing experiences. And some of the house church estimates, especially in rural areas, are much higher than that. Now, there's no way I can go back and verify that, but we're probably talking, whatever the exact percentage is, we're probably talking about millions of people, given the growth of the church in China. Dr. Balkrishna Sharma from Nepal shared with me that 80% of people who become Christians in Nepal become Christians as a result of signs and wonders. So there's no reason to say, however you explain them, there's no reason to say the same things couldn't have been reported in the ministry of Jesus. But again, that's one of the major reasons for skepticism about the Gospels that is being exported from the West. This survey kind of seems like too much to me, but it was a survey in 1981 where they said that 10% of non-Christians in Chennai said they had been healed when somebody prayed for them in the name of Jesus. The survey said Madras, but it's Chennai now. Pastor Israel was one of my students from India, and through prayer for the sick, his Baptist church grew from about a handful of people to over 600. The way I found out about this, actually, I came home back to the seminary one night, and I had a really bad headache. And he said, "Oh, brother, let me pray for you." And he prayed for me, and nothing happened. I said, "It's because I had no faith." He said, "No, brother, it doesn't work here, but everybody I pray for in India gets healed." I don't know. This was another of my students. He's now doing his doctorate elsewhere. But he worked with Bari Malto. And everybody in his area of India knew about Bari Malto. Bari Malto had been a shaman in his village. And then he contracted leprosy. And he was cast out of the village. Well, one night, there were a couple ladies, I think they were Pentecostal actually, they prayed for him, and that night he dreamed that an angel came and touched him. He woke up completely healed of leprosy, went into the village, the entire village was converted, and by the time my student went to work there, half the region had been converted. Well, many of these places where the Christian movement is spreading rapidly, it's because of events like this. Douglas Norwood, a Moravian pastor, in 1994, went to a place in Suriname. Suriname has a high Christian population, but there was a particular people group in Suriname that had a very low Christian population. It was predominantly Hindu. And he went, they were descended from people from India. He went to Nikari, Suriname, and the churches there got together and held a prayer meeting together, which was very rare. Because after centuries of people trying to evangelize in that region, they only had a handful they had like maybe a couple hundred Christians, a handful of churches. And the churches were actually competing with each other for the same Christians. You know, no, come to my church, no, come to my church. We would never do that today, right? We all get along with each other, right? Anyway, so he was leading them in prayer, and as they began to pray, they began to confess to one another, "We're sorry for competing with you. We should have been loving you. We should have been," and they got excited and they went out and started telling their neighbors about what had happened and about the services of their church. So that night, a bunch of people from the community came to the church because they wanted to see, you know, these Christians, they're acting different. What's going on with them? So they came to the church. Oh, sorry. I guess I need to stay on the slide. They came to the church, and they set a man down on the mat on the floor right in front of Doug, who wrote about this in his dissertation, and Doug and I talked about it as well. The man was paralyzed on one side, and he was like, Doug thinks he was maybe in his 80s. The man had been paralyzed on one side all his life, and the man started shouting at him and saying, "I don't believe in your God. I don't believe in my gods, because no gods have ever done anything for me. I defy this Christian God." And all of a sudden, his paralyzed arm shot up in the air, and he looked at it, and he was converted, and the people around him looked at it, and they were converted. And that was the beginning of a people movement, what missiologists call a people movement. After that time, tens of thousands of people, since 1994, tens of thousands of people in this area had become Christians, and that was the catalyst, and Doug was an eyewitness of it. Again, nobody even touched the man. Nobody prayed for the man, but in that context, he was healed. And this goes way back. I mean, how many of you know some of the creeds of the church? Like the Nicene Creed and so on. We often look back to that as a formative period in Christian theology. Not that we don't still think new ways about Christian theology, but we often look back to that as a formative period. But that was also a formative period. The same people who were talking about the doctrine of the Trinity or Christology or so on were also talking about miracles taking place. And some of them talking about that they saw them. Ramsay McMullen, a professor of history at Yale, was really surprised to find as he examined the sources that the leading cause of conversion to Christianity in the 3rd and 4th centuries were healings and exorcisms. It was a prominent feature of the Korean revival. I know I just skipped like 1,500 years of history, but I'm trying to be brief. What I need to say with this, though, is, now, well, you guys already know that, so for the sake of time, I'm going to skip ahead. Eyewitness testimony is a form of evidence in sociology, anthropology, law, journalism, and of course, where I work in historiography. And we have a lot of eyewitness testimony, so these are just some samples of it. One principle that I'm following is that a smaller number of eyewitnesses should count more heavily than a larger number of skeptical non-witnesses. What I mean, I can illustrate this way. If you have a traffic accident, like on these congested Jakarta roads, if you have a traffic accident and a police officer says, interviewing witnesses, well, tell me what happened. And somebody comes along and says, no, don't listen to them. That's not what happened. And the officer says, well, can you tell me what you saw happen? I didn't see anything happen. I wasn't there. That's why I know nothing happened. We wouldn't take that seriously. But that's what people sometimes do with miracles. Well, I didn't see it, so I know it didn't happen. We dismiss other people's testimonies. Now, you can't believe everybody's testimony, but you can believe reliable witnesses. That you still have to evaluate what really happened to them, but, you know, we have that in the Gospels too. Am I going too long? 15 more? Okay. And also, I'm not claiming that everybody gets healed. As you can see, I wear glasses. I have male pattern balding. And my students often say there's something else wrong with my head. So the point of miracles is not that they always happen or that they solve all the world's problems. We still need to work for justice, for health care, for sharing food and so forth. We need to work for all those things. But the point is that the miracles show us what God cares about. God cares about people's needs and invites us to do the same, whether through praying for them, that God will do a miracle, or whenever we have it in our power also to help them in other ways. I don't know if any of you know of Wansuk and Julie Ma, but they have a number of accounts, but one of the accounts that they gave me was, and actually this picture was taken when I was visiting them when I was at Oxford giving a lecture on miracles. But Wansuk and Julie tell of a large toxic goiter. When they prayed, it disappeared instantly. And they were not the only ones who saw it. There were other eyewitnesses there as well. My brother Chris and I saw something. Chris later did a PhD in physics, but this was shortly after my conversion. I did not start out as a Christian. I started out as an atheist. And so when I was converted, I still had a little bit of skepticism. You know, I was a Christian, but I was helping at a Bible study in a nursing home. And there was a lady there named Barbara. And she said, I wish I could walk. Every week she would say, I wish I could walk. And finally, the Bible study leader, who was a charismatic, said, I'm tired of this. He went over to her, grabbed her by the hand, lifted her up, and said, in the name of Jesus Christ, rise up and walk. I was scared. I thought she was going to fall on the ground. And I could see her face. She thought she was going to fall on the ground. But he walked her around the room. And from then on, Barbara could walk. That's when I saw with my own eyes. This is a different Barbara. She was sent home to die. She had advanced multiple sclerosis. She had a particularly severe case of this. She needed a respirator to help her breathe. Her muscles were such, she was all curled up. She said that she was curled up like a pretzel. They actually had to pry her hands open every month or so to let the dead skin get out. And I don't know what this had to do with multiple sclerosis, but she'd also gone blind. She'd been deteriorating for about 15 years, and they told her family she was going to die any time. Well, some people had prayed for her, and some friends were visiting her when she suddenly heard a voice saying, "Rise up and walk." And it wasn't coming from any of her friends. She jumped out of the bed, which she couldn't have been able to do. Her muscles didn't allow her to do that. She jumped out of the bed, and the first thing she noticed was that her feet were not curled up. They were flat on the ground. The second thing she noticed was that her hands weren't curled up. And the third thing she noticed was she could see all these things. She was instantly and completely healed. Now, often when somebody is healed of something, their muscles are still atrophied. You know, it's still like hard to move because it takes time. You have to practice, you have to exercise. But she was completely healed. I checked with her doctors. They all confirmed that this happened, that this is true. I have written responses from their doctors about this, some of whom have also written about it elsewhere. That was in 1981. So this wasn't just a temporary remission. This, she's gone on and lived the rest of her life with no more symptoms of this. I'm going to skip this one. Greg Spencer was legally blind. He'd already been registered as legally blind. In the US, he was put on government support because he was legally blind. He went to, it was 2,200 in one eye, 2,400 in the other. It was due to macular degeneration. So it wasn't like just in his head, it was physically something wrong with him. He went to a retreat for the healing of the mind. He wasn't praying for the healing of his sight, he was only praying for the healing of his mind. While he was praying for the healing of his mind, he felt like God healed his mind. He opened his eyes and he could see. And this was confirmed by other doctors. I blocked it. Actually, I wouldn't have to block out the names here in Indonesia, but because of privacy laws, I had to block them out for the US. But there was one disadvantage. You see, now the government did an investigation. They said, you can't be healed of macular degeneration. It doesn't just go away. But after getting all the medical records, which we have, they said, indeed, you've experienced a remarkable return of your vision. Well, you're no longer qualified for disability. He had to go back to work. This is somebody who was healed in India. Well, let me do this one. A friend of mine who works with Cambridge University prayed for a blind man in northern India with clouded eyes. And the man was healed. This is the field where he ran in circles praising God. And he began to weep that night as he was talking with children at the orphanage about his experience. And they said, why are you weeping? He said, because I've always heard the sound of children's voices, but I'd never seen their faces. This is a medically documented account of a girl who was, a 9-year-old girl who was healed of deafness due to auditory nerve damage, which again is not something that goes away. In terms of limbs growing back, this is the story of Bruce Van Natta. He was crushed under a truck. Most of his small intestine was destroyed. A friend, I'm just abbreviating this so I can get done in the time. How much do I have left now? 5 minutes. So a friend felt led to go there, prayed for him, said, in the name of Jesus, small intestine grow. His small intestine more than doubled in length. Again, we have the medical documentation for this from his doctor. I don't know if any of you have heard of Roland and Heidi Baker. They're friends of mine, but both they and other people who are there have given eyewitness reports of just massive numbers of people being healed of deafness when they prayed for them. These were people in completely non-Christian villages. They prayed for, the people were healed. The next day they would start a church in the village. And I have friends, other friends who were there, professors who've been there and seen these things happen. But it's also been documented with medical tests, some published in the Southern Medical Journal in 2010. Some people complained about that, so one of the authors of the study published a book called Testing Prayer with Harvard University Press in 2012, and she has a chapter on this showing, yes, these people went from being blind or deaf to being healed afterwards. And these are just some of the other witnesses. She's a professor of church history at a seminary in the US, Methodist seminary. And their healings caught on video, but let me skip ahead to, because some people say people never get raised from the dead. And actually, when I started working on the book on miracles, there was one of the stories I already knew about, but when I started asking around among my friends, do you ever know of any miracles? And some of them began sharing with me some experiences. So among people that I know, there are 10 people that I know personally who claim to have witnessed being raised from the dead. Well, actually, one of them claims to have been raised from the dead, so he wasn't actually a witness. But anyway, he was dead at the time. But it's multiply attested in the early sources about Jesus that he raised people from the dead. We have accounts of it subsequently. Augustine, John Wesley, and so on. Chauncey Crandall, a cardiologist from West Palm Beach, gives his account of how somebody was dead for about 40 minutes or 45 minutes, no, 40 minutes, sorry. And he prayed for him, and the guy came back and also became a believer, and here's Dr. Crandall participating in his baptism. Dr. Sean George from Australia actually himself died and was raised, and those are the medical, he has the medical records, of course. Let me skip ahead to, yeah, that one was in Indonesia. This is one of my friends. He gave an account. He's a professor now in the US. He's from Nigeria. Some other friends that I know. Let me get to, since I have to go past, let me get to this one. This was one of the ones that really opened my eyes to the reality of these things happening. Because, you know, I still had a little bit of skepticism, even though I'd seen some things. But I knew about this story about Antoinette Malambe, but then I got to interview her and got more details. Antoinette Malambe said that her daughter Therese, when she was 2 years old, cried out that she was bitten by a snake. So Antoinette Malambe, there was no help, no medical help available in the village, so she strapped the child to her back and ran to a nearby village and asked a family friend to pray. The child hadn't been breathing the whole time. So I asked her, how long was the child not breathing? She had to stop and think to get from one village to the next. She said about 3 hours. 6 minutes with no oxygen, you get irreparable brain damage. Well, the family friend, Coco Ngoma Moise, prayed for Therese. She started breathing again right away. The next day she was fine. Therese has no brain damage. She finished her master's degree. She's now a pastor in Congo. And the reason this story really got my attention is because Therese is my sister-in-law. Antoinette Malambe is my mother-in-law. So this is my own family. And not to doubt one's mother-in-law, but we did check with Coco Moise, and he confirmed the story. He was the other witness. Yeah.
Thank you. Last one is very interesting. Beliau dari tadi menunjuk ke saya ketika beliau berkata karismatik. Mungkin sebagian yang tidak kenal saya bertanya-tanya mengapa selalu ke saya gitu ya. Saya adalah psikolog tangga bagi yang belum mengetahuinya. Saya adalah dosen perjanjian baru di STFT Jakarta. Jadi itu sebabnya beliau selalu tunjuk ke saya kalau mau Pentakosta organisasi. Dan ternyata beliau juga orang Pentakosta. Dia Pentakosta. Okay. So we come to a pause for 5 to 10 minutes. You may go to the restaurant if you want, and we provide coffees you can drink, and we provide also snacks. But please, since we are a bunch of people here, many people come, please one person take only one snack. Then we will gather together again at 4:20 at the last.
penuh.
Kita segera mulai sesi tanya jawab yang ada di luar. Kami mohon untuk segera masuk kembali ke dalam ruangan. Mohon yang di luar boleh datang, boleh masuk ke dalam ruangan. Kita akan segera memulai. Pintunya boleh ditutup. Zeta boleh tolong tutup pintunya. Pintunya tolong ditutup. Baik, Ibu Bapak yang terkasih, kita ada waktu tersisa 35 sampai maksimal 40 menit sampai jam 5, paling tidak 5:05, berhubung tadi kita telat 5 menit memulainya. Dan kita akan memulai sesi tanya jawab. Tadi makalah berbicara tentang dua hal. Yang pertama tentang Injil-Injil sinoptik terkait dengan genre dan juga terkait dengan historisitas dari Yesus maupun juga kisah-kisah tentang Yesus. Tadi beliau menyebutkan banyak sekali, bukan hanya penulis dalam kelompok Kristiani, tetapi juga penulis dalam kelompok-kelompok non-Kristiani, dan saya mendengar beberapa nama tadi disebut seperti Nakibus dan lain-lain. Saya mau menurut saya ini salah satu yang beliau sebut tadi. Suetonius adalah sejarawan tetapi bukan orang Kristen yang di dalamnya menceritakan beberapa kaisar Romawi, dan di dalamnya dalam salah satu kisah menyinggung nama Kristus. Ini adalah salah satu saksi di luar Injil, di luar gereja yang mengisahkan sedikit saja tentang Kristus. Tapi sayangnya ini dalam bahasa Jerman, jadi Bapak tidak bisa meminjamnya dari saya. Dan yang berikutnya juga saya membawa dua buku dari penulis yang sama. Tadi beliau juga menyinggung tentang Josephus, dan Josephus saya memiliki dua buku. Ini tentang masa kuno Yahudi, dan kemudian satu lagi tentang perang Yahudi. Dalam dua buku ini yang ditulis oleh Flavius Josephus, di mana beliau bercerita tentang Yudaisme termasuk perangnya dan bersinggungan cukup banyak dengan kekristenan dan gerakan Yesus. Jadi beliau yang menceritakan tadi ada sebagian terdapat di sini dan juga dalam bahasa Jerman. Dan saya juga ingat tadi satu hal ketika beliau bercerita tentang Memory of Jesus dalam kuliah hermeneutika yang saya ajarkan baik di kampus ini maupun di dua kampus yang lain, tentang bagaimana seseorang bisa mengingat memori masa lalu. Saya cukup sering mengambil contoh misalnya kepada bapak-bapak yang umur 50, 60, 70 tahun untuk mengingat masa waktu SD atau SMP. Dan biasanya masa SD SMP akan sulit diingat, tetapi momen-momen di mana dia ada momen-momen penting dia ingat. Nah, salah satu yang saya cek adalah jikalau bapak-bapak pernah jatuh cinta waktu SMP. Waktu bapak-bapak jatuh cinta waktu SMP, sepanjang kuliah saya di beberapa seminari, saya tanyakan, dan biasanya yang ketika saya tanya, beliau pasti ingat wanita seperti apa yang dia sukai, sampai detail rambutnya, baju yang sering dipakai, dan seterusnya. Jadi ini sekedar menambahkan atau mengafirmasi apa yang beliau katakan, bahwa untuk momen-momen atau event-event yang khusus biasanya kita tidak lupa. Dan selalu ketika saya uji seperti itu terbukti benar adanya. Nah sekarang kalau ada ibu bapak yang ingin bertanya, baik topik yang pertama tentang Memory of Jesus dan Synoptic Gospels dan Historicity of Jesus, atau tentang yang kedua yang berbicara mengenai mukjizat, boleh kita masuk dalam turn pertama, di mana 3 orang boleh bertanya. Ibu bapak boleh bertanya dalam bahasa Indonesia, tetapi akan lebih baik dalam bahasa Inggris jika bisa, supaya lebih menghemat waktu. Sekarang kita buka term yang pertama, ada 1, 2, dan 3. Sementara untuk 3 orang ini dulu, dan nampaknya 3-3-nya bisa berbahasa Inggris dengan fasih. Silakan.
Good afternoon, sir. I'm Wendy Hutahaya from Orthodox Coptic Church of Indonesia. Just now you explained it, even though it's a little bit, about School of Alexandria as the central of knowledge in the past, in the New Testament era. So I want to ask, what do you know about School of Alexandria, and what is the relationship and the development, or its role toward the New Testament development and eras? Thank you very much.
Alexander is mentioned in Acts 18:24 because Apollos was from Alexandria, and it speaks of him as a man powerful in word, which was actually a common expression back then for somebody who was really well trained in rhetoric or was an orator. And also he was thoroughly versed in scriptures. He knew the scriptures really well, and he was an excellent speaker. And he already knew about Jesus some, but he didn't know as much as he could know. And so Aquila and Priscilla took him aside and taught him more. Also, the ship later on in Acts chapter 27, there's an Alexandrian grain ship that's bound for Rome because of the grain trade that went. You know, Egypt had been a mighty empire, but in the 1st century, Rome really exploited Egypt. So we have from the papyri, the business documents from Egypt, it looks like the childhood mortality rate was about 50%. So about half of all children born would never survive to become adults. Meanwhile, because of all the grain that was exported to Rome, this exploitation, you have something like 400,000 tons of grain. I don't know what that is in metric equivalent, but 400,000 tons of grain exported from Egypt to Rome every year, so that the people of Rome could eat free, while many of the children of Egypt died of starvation and malnutrition. So in Revelation 18, you have this oracle against this economic injustice. And it lists especially luxury items, but it also lists wheat, which wasn't a luxury item, but it was the massive exports from Egypt to Rome were on the back of the Egyptian poor. The traditions after the New Testament, actually, I think Zenas was from Alexandria too. Apollo, well, I know Apollos was anyway, but after the New Testament, we have the tradition that Mark went to Alexandria, and of course we have Alexandria becoming one of the major sees with the monarchical bishops. Constantinople, Antioch, Jerusalem, and of course Rome, and Alexandria. And it was a major center of learning. Actually, before the Christian period, it was a major center of learning for Jewish people, Philo of Alexandria was a major, significant figure. But the Jewish community was essentially wiped out in the early 2nd century, genocide. Alexandrian Jews had been agitated for citizen rights, and the Greeks said, no, our ancestors founded the city. Even though it was in Egypt, they didn't want the Egyptians or the Jews to be citizens. Only the Greeks who came with Alexander the Great and afterwards, they wanted to claim it was only their city. They actually called it Alexandria near Egypt. But it was a center of learning, major center of philosophy, especially Platonic philosophy in the 1st and 2nd century. Tarsus was another major center of philosophy, especially Stoic philosophy. Of course, Athens, although Alexandria was really a stronger educational center than Athens by the 1st century. You didn't want me to go on like the later church there, right, the Coptic church. You just wanted me to talk about the 1st century? Okay. Was that enough? Okay.
We move on to the second question.
Hello, Professor Peter. Thanks. It is very good to have you here. I'm Isabella from here, from this school. I have 2 questions regarding your first lecture and 1 comment for your second lecture. I'll just read the questions. The first question, you emphasize the significance of facts in the ancient biography. But later on, you also mentioned that for the ancient biography, the sequence, the order of the narrative itself is not really mattered. So, could you please tell me more what you mean when you mention about the facts if the sequence is not counted? And the second one.
Can we do these? Can we do these one at a time?
Okay.
It's just easier for me. I talked about the people with great memories, but I am not one of them. And thank you, both of you are asking very good questions. But that it's not the sequence. Normally, when we remember things, we remember episodes, but we don't usually remember when they occurred unless they're linked with something. So it's the same way with ancient biographies. They actually usually didn't even know what sequence things occurred in. They had all these stories about people, but they didn't know which came first or which came in what year. It was different if the person was an emperor, because then you had annals, you had the official records, but not usually for teachers, sages. Also, in terms of chronological sequence, they didn't put things in chronological sequence because they arranged things topically. So, like, what Suetonius does, he's a biographer of Roman emperors, and even though he had records, he didn't do them chronologically. He said, here were Nero's good deeds, and here were Nero's bad deeds. He spends a lot of time on Nero's bad deeds. And for some other emperors, he has more on the good deeds, but he separates them out topically. Am I answering your question? So, your second question.
Second one. What will happen if the personal memory of the teaching, of Jesus' teaching, does not coincide, is that the right term? Coincide the communal memory. The personal memory does not coincide the communal memory. So, was there any difficulties in the process of finding the substance of Jesus' teaching? Because you talk a lot about the substance itself.
Yeah. By the way, in terms of the chronology, they usually would put the death after the life. I mean, there were certain things they knew about the chronology, but yeah, generally. In terms of the personal memory and the collective memory, this is a very advanced question, very good question. So you're undoubtedly a very advanced student. Either that or somebody here is teaching about this. Oh, okay. Where did she do it?
The comic.
Isabella, you may introduce yourself. You have done your master degree in the US, right? Maybe you should introduce yourself first.
I'm Isabella. I'm doing a lot of research on disability of theology. Theology of disability. Yeah, I did my master on theology also in Economic Theological Seminary in Chicago. Yeah.
Good. Yeah, so that's one of the areas in memory research where they make a clear distinction now is between the personal memories and the collective memories. And you've got the long-term memory of the community. Part of it depends on what sources they're depending on. I mean, it looks like the Gospel of John claims to depend on the testimony of the beloved disciple. And the beloved disciple doesn't seem to be telling always exactly the same story as the kind of memory of the community that you have in the Synoptic Gospels, especially in the Passion narrative. It almost looks like he's deliberately tweaking it, maybe for symbolic reasons or whatever. But if they diverge, back then, I think what they would say is where we have to check it most is the memory of the leading figures, the people who were the disciples. Because usually in ancient history and ancient biography, they would try to check things with the eyewitnesses if they were still available. Now, they start getting pretty thin. I mean, there are a lot fewer of those witnesses around after 70. According to tradition, Peter and Paul were both martyred in Rome, although there's been some debate about Peter that I just read yesterday. I don't remember where I was reading it, but in any case, by the late 1st century, you don't have a whole lot of eyewitnesses left. So all you have is the collective memory. Today, obviously, we can't go back and consult the eyewitnesses. Well, as Christians, we believe one of the eyewitnesses is still alive because he came back. But we can't consult eyewitnesses historically because they're no longer among us. So all we have are the records. So the only way I think we can check it today is by looking for consistency and multiple attestation. You know, the kinds of methods we usually use in traditional historical Jesus research, which are also a matter of debate today. Some of them, like the criterion of double dissimilarity, I think most historical Jesus scholars no longer use that, and I think rightly so, because it's not, it doesn't really make good sense when you think about it. But then, looking for Aramaisms, looking for Galilean features, what we know of Galilean topography, what we know of Galilean culture, and archaeology, and so on. But sometimes all we can do is say, this, historically we can't pass a verdict on this with certainty. Well, actually, history never gives you the kind of certainty you have in physics or mathematics. But we can say, this likely coheres with the Jesus that we know about. McIver, in his 2011 book on Memory of Jesus and the Synoptic Gospels with SBL Press, points out that in memory studies, the kind of memory mistakes that people make in personal memory, After living memory, of course, the collective memory can go way off. But the kind of mistakes we usually make in personal memory are things that are mistakes within the same category. So if you give somebody a psychological test and you give them words to remember, and you say pillow, slumber, bed, night, and then you ask them to repeat back their memory of the list, usually they won't have verbatim memory. Usually they'll have gist memory. So they may see the word sleep. Well, that's technically a mistake. It's not the exact word, but it's related to it. They don't say fireman or palace. So if they made memory mistakes, they were probably mistakes that were consistent with the character of Jesus that they knew on the personal level. If I'm not answering your question, feel free to bring up more. And if you have some comments to add to it from your own study, feel free to add those too.
You still have one comment for the second presentation?
Thank you for answering the questions. And the second one is more about your second lecture about miracle. Because I've been researching on disability theology, so I've been doing some reading on disability books, disability theology books. One of the books is Disabled God by Nancy Eslon, and also Healing Homiletics by Kathy Beck. Both of them agree that the way we read the Bible, especially the healing narratives of Jesus, put people with disability as the object. Both of them agree for this case. And they believe that the healing narratives can be both liberating people with disability or oppressing people with disability. The way we read the narrative itself, we tend to read the narrative as the healing is similar with curing. Because these two people differ the healing from curing. They believe that we misinterpret the Bible as like what you've explained, miracle that you explained is much more about the curing, while both of them will see the miracle is more about curing. It's more like fixing the impairment of the body. They read the Jesus healing narrative as healing in this term. It's not merely about fixing the impairment. It's not really about like biological response about what Jesus did, but it's more about restorative faith. It's more about Jesus restore the dignity of the person. Jesus reconcile the relationship between that person with the society. Jesus like fulfill the wholeness of that person to be like the term to be whole again. So what do you think about this when they hardly differ these two terms, healing and curing? Thank you.
Sometimes that distinction, well, my friend John Pilch also makes that distinction when he's doing anthropological, medical anthropology and applying that to the New Testament. And there, you don't have to define the words that way, but you can define the words in such a way as to make such a distinction. Now, the first thing I should say is that the healing narratives can be read in a way that's harmful to people with disabilities. One of the studies I read was about the church in China, certain parts of the church in China, because there's a lot of different parts of the church in China, but when they pray for the sick, there was a good side to it and a bad side to it. That they were, this part of the church anyway, they would never give up on the person. These were people who in the broader society, people would shun them or give up on them because of their disability. But their church would never give up and would always keep praying for them. And they appreciated that. But the downside of it was that the church also looked down on them. Not as much as the society, but they thought that if they didn't get healed, they didn't have enough faith. And you never see that in the Bible. You never see somebody, no, you never see that in the Bible, them condemning people for saying you should have gotten healed. And I actually think, even though the New Testament, the focus of the narratives is going to be the people who get healed, because that's what's interesting to the readers. But clearly Jesus didn't envision everybody getting healed, because he gives instructions in Luke 14, although it's only in Luke, but in Luke 14 he says, when you give a banquet, invite the disabled, invite those who can't walk, and so forth. So he wasn't envisioning that everybody will always get healed. And even in Mozambique, the example I gave there, where actually the majority of people who were deaf that they prayed for got healed. Some people didn't. And they didn't know why. They didn't know what to do about it. Some of the blind people didn't get healed, so they set up schools for the blind, because they didn't know what to do with it. But one of the mistakes that people have often made, I think, with the miracle narratives in the West is, at least following the Antiochian school, not the Alexandrian school, but the majority of the Antiochian school, you don't allegorize the narratives. But when it comes to healing narratives in the West, people have often allegorized them. They would try to get a spiritual meaning out of it. And I think the spiritual point is there, but I also think, especially when you take Luke, Acts together and see how it was carried on in the early Christian movement, that part of the message also is that there is healing, and that God does do that. Now, as to whether it's physical cure or social restoration, obviously the healing of a leper, if it's a physical restoration, it's also going to be a social restoration, because lepers were excluded as unclean. That wasn't true for every kind of disability, but it wasn't true for blindness or deafness, so far as I know, from the New Testament. But a person who is physically cured, it also can have social repercussions. But if a scholar today says, no, these are only about the social, and they don't include the physical, I think that's doing the same thing that the allegorical approach is doing. In playing down, well, they're not meaning to play down the importance of physical health, but physical health really is something that God cares about. And the narratives show us that we should care about it, whether by medical means or whatever means at our disposal to try to care about physical infirmities. And I think that in the West, there's this tendency to shy away from that because of the legacy of Hume. So it is valuable that these scholars will say, okay, there's the social dimension to it. It's also valuable for them to say, let's make sure we don't abuse these narratives in a way that marginalizes people. But I think it's also important for us to attend to the fact that, in contrast to the Western kind of Platonic view that what matters is what's spiritual and not physical, that God really is interested in physical as well. And these narratives do talk about physical healing. And actually some of the examples that I gave, I had to hurry through a lot of them, but people sometimes do get healed physically, cured physically, from leprosy or deafness or blindness or raising. Obviously there were a lot of, the broader category is the social, because Jesus was reaching out to marginalized people. The physically disabled were among them. They were excluded from centers of power in their culture. Women were usually excluded from the centers of power in that culture, unless like you were like Herodias or somebody. And of course, in that society, people respected religious practitioners like the Pharisees, people like tax collectors and the ones they called sinners were morally marginalized. The poor were marginalized from this, who were the majority of people, but they were marginalized from power too. So we definitely see the social implications, and this is part of that. But I don't think we should play down the physical aspect either. I think part of that is due to the Western prejudice. Of course, I'm Western, but anyway.
Kita bakal ada pertanyaan yang ketiga, Pak Ninju Sasongko, silakan. Please introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Ninju Sasongko.
Do you need the mic or not?
Oh, check. It's off. So, I can cheer, but investment is not my area. My area is spirituality. I went to the same school with your student, 2001, in the evangelical seminary, and then I did my master's in spirituality at Seattle University in Seattle. No, it's not. It's the Jesuit Seattle University. I have a couple of questions for you. First, one at a time. Okay, sure. The first is, how do you comment on the role of imagination in the Jesus research? Because as Professor Bill Allison recently published a book on constructing Jesus.
It's a good book.
Yes, it is. And he has the subtitle Memory, Imagination, and History. And if I'm not mistaken, he comes to the conclusion that we cannot have factuality or historicity in Jesus. But the role of imagination is very important in the
When we take disparate facts or memories and we put them together, that draws on imagination, because we're really constructing our memories. So we don't just have the raw data. In fact, if we remembered everything and it was just raw data and no interpretation, that would be a nightmare. I could tell you what I had for breakfast 2.5 years ago on Thursday, but no, that wouldn't be useful. It just, our minds would be cluttered. So in the same way with historical data, it gets framed in a narrative, depending on who's telling the narrative. It's not exactly true that history is always written by the winners, because Josephus was not on the winning side of the Jewish war, but history is constructed by those whose reports of it survive, and so on. So, imagination is involved in thinking, how do these things fit together? How do we present a coherent picture of Jesus? Dale, whom I know, is not actually saying we can't know much about Jesus. He thinks we can know a lot about Jesus, but not the usual historical Jesus constructions that draw a lot of imagination and are very selective. He's a bit skeptical of some of the traditional criteria that are used. And with memory research, I think he gives a fairly balanced perspective on that. But he actually thinks something like the Sermon on the Plain in Luke chapter 6, something like that could have actually, it's short enough it could have actually been passed on by tradition. Ancient biographers could rearrange their materials, so it doesn't really matter to me if it was all given on one occasion or on different occasions. It could just be memories of teachings and they're put together, but they seem to have been put together in queue before Luke and Matthew both get on them. So I guess we could speak of reconstruction at different stages. All the people who were passing on the tradition, all the people who were writing the tradition, and then how we put the tradition together today in reconstructing it. Your other question?
My other question is, well, I did a ministry in Addis Ababa for a year, back in 2009, 2010. And the Mennonite church there, I am from Mennonite. So
They have a strong Mennonite church in Ethiopia. It's... Yeah, that's it. Okay.
Okay, so the Ethiopian Mennonites are more coastal.
Yes.
So
And the Lutherans too.
it is true. And I did not have issues regarding miracles, but I did not hear you say something about.
I did not hear in your presentation, especially the second part, you did not touch on demon possessions. And are you planning to do another book on demon possessions as a motif, perhaps, for the Jesus research?
I actually have an appendix on it in the Miracles book. The appendix is about 60 pages long. But don't unplug that yet. I have a few slides on it. So may as well. I have a whole presentation on that, but I don't. We don't have time to do the whole presentation. So let me talk about some nature miracles. And okay, anthropologists. Thanks. Anthropologists have documented widely spirit possession in different cultures. Now, most of the anthropologists don't believe that these are genuine spirits, but the way some anthropologists have put it is the denial of possession trances that are indigenous and interpreted as spirits are regarded as the anthropological equivalent of being a flat earther. So here are people who don't necessarily believe in spirits themselves. Some of them do, but probably the majority of them from the West do not believe that they're real spirits. But they still attest the kinds of experiences that are also talked about in the Gospels. Now, yeah, oops, that's right, I'm too far away. 74% of societies have spirit possession beliefs. And actually that was already documented in the 1970s, so they probably have found it in more societies since then. It varies from one part of the world to another, but I guess I could go ahead and talk about some of my own experience. But let me give just one story. This isn't a spirit possession. Can I stand up? This is when I tell a story, I like to stand. So this story is not a verbatim memory from my brother-in-law, but it is the gist. You can tell that this is my brother-in-law because we have matching shirts. But Emmanuel is a professor of chemistry at the University of Brazzaville. So he's a scientist. And here's an account that he gave me. I also have some experiences with this. But mine, well actually this one's pretty unpleasant also. But anyway, I'll tell you his story because he's a scientist. He also teaches Sunday school here in Brazzaville. And there were three boys in his Sunday school class that always stuck together. And at one point, one of them felt very sick, and after a couple of months, he died. And then the second one fell sick at the same time as the first one died. The second one fell sick, and after about a month, he died. And the third one fell sick, and then he came to Emmanuel and the other Sunday school teachers and said, "Please pray for me. This is what happened. We weren't supposed to tell anybody or the spell wouldn't work, but we had entered into like a curse that we would all get special powers to become like government officials if we just gave this man a little bit of our blood." And The first one, shortly after that happened, he had a nightmare where the same man stabbed him with the same knife. That's when he fell sick. And the night that he died, the second one had the same nightmare. The night that he died, the third one had the same nightmare. And that's when he came and said, please pray for me. He was very sick himself and was expecting that he would die. So they banded together, they prayed and fasted during the day for 9 days. And then they went and prayed for him, and he was healed or cured. And I've talked with Emmanuel recently, he's still fine. You know, that was the end of it. But just I tell that story just to put a different twist on it, that to recognize that there actually may be a reality. You know, what we can document from the scientific literature is that people experience what they believe to be, or others believe to be, spirit possession. But I actually think that there is also empirical evidence that, and I have some other documented reports. I just give this one because it's from my brother-in-law. That there actually is such a thing as real spirits. Not everything everybody claims to be, like, you know. Actually, in ancient rabbinic literature, especially from the 3rd century forward, sometimes they said if you stretch your hand out, your right hand out, it's into 1,000 demons. If you stretch your left hand out, it's into 10,000 demons. Which I guess is prejudiced against the left hand. But anyway, that is going too far. I mean, that's not. But I really think there really is such a thing as real spirits. We believe in one God, but that doesn't mean we don't acknowledge that there are other spiritual forces that work in the world. At least that's what I think. Do you want to?
Berhubung waktunya sudah jam 5:05, tadi saya berharap kita bisa ada sesi kedua, tetapi mohon maaf Ibu Bapak, mau tidak mau kita harus sudahi karena sudah jam 5:05. Kalau kita ini tidak bisa saja sampai malam nanti kalau kita lanjutkan. Dan sebelum kita sudahi, saya ingin mengingatkan untuk mahasiswa-mahasiswa saya yang saya wajibkan hadir di sini dari semester 2, saya minta untuk membuat reflection paper. Ya. Tentunya saya mewajibkan mahasiswa saya untuk hadir dari semester 2, baik dari mata kuliah pengantar PP maupun Inggris teologi. Karena saya melihat pentingnya ini baik untuk practicing English maupun juga untuk materi perjanjian barunya. Jadi tolong jangan lupa reflection paper. Baik rekan-rekan sekalian, ini adalah bagian dari kerjasama kita yang kecil dengan Sola Scriptura, di mana beliau diundang oleh Sola Scriptura untuk memimpin seminar. Brosurnya tentu Bapak sudah tahu semua, akan diadakan seminar tentang tema wahyu dalam 12 sesi. Yang mau hadir silakan hadir, diundang oleh Sola Scriptura untuk hadir. Dan yang kedua, kami juga akan mengadakan seminar kembali. Kampus kami sangat sibuk dengan seminar-seminar dari Dewan Gereja Sedunia, World Council of Churches. Persisnya bisa dilihat dari website STFT Jakarta. Dan kami mengundang Bapak Yusak Soleman sebagai ketua dari STFT. We invite Reverend Yusak Soleman as our
This is our small token of gratitude for your very lively presentation. I just joined the last part of your presentation, but I believe for most of the audience who follow your lecture from the very beginning, as the last part, I see how you tell the story very lively. So I hope this small token just to present our gratitude for your coming here and share your story with us.
I have the more recent book on biographies and the Book of Miracles, but this is the original book on the historical Jesus of the Gospels, and I wanted to present this for your library, or if you already have it, you can give it to your Testament professor. So I wanted to present this.
Rekan-rekan sekalian, kita akan menutupnya dengan doa. Saya meminta salah satu dari mahasiswa STFT Jakarta untuk berdoa yang di atas. Saya minta Joseph untuk berdoa.
Mari kita berdoa. Di sore hari, ya Allah, kami mengucap syukur kepadamu karena atas berkat dan rahmat-Mu yang melimpah yang masih Kau berikan kepada kami. Terima kasih ya Allah. Terima kasih juga ya Bapak, karena kami masih bisa berkesempatan untuk mendengar seminar yang berskala internasional ini. Kiranya materi yang disampaikan oleh pembicara boleh kami pakai, boleh kami cerna dan kami mendapat intinya. Kiranya setiap dari kami yang telah mengikuti seminar ini boleh mengerti apa maksud dari artikel yang disampaikan oleh pembicara. Dan sekarang kami akan kembali ke tempat kami masing-masing ya Allah. Kiranya Engkau terus menaungi dan menjaga kami sampai ke tempat peristirahatan kami masing-masing. Dalam nama-Mu kami berdoa. Amin.
Bapak, dengan demikian seminar kami kita telah selesai. Terima kasih.